Hootie Hoot Productions presents the Sports Deli Podcast, where everyone deserves a seat at the table, where we discuss the intersection between race and sports, mental health, leadership, and equality. To find out more about the Sports Deli Podcast, check us out online at thesportsdelipodcast.com. We are starting to have free giveaways. If you hear giveaway anywhere in the podcast, send us an email to thesportsdeli@gmail.com with giveaway in the subject heading, and in the body of the email, give us the answer to that podcast's specific question.
Yeah. Stephen A. Smith is my alter ego. Go somewhere else with that shit.
John, she's roasting your ass right from the jump. We ain't done the intro yet. What the fuck?
To me, Colin Kaepernick is a hero.
And Colin Kaepernick is going to go down as a legend. And when George Floyd called out to his mother, he called out to all mothers. And I heard his call.
So do you have white privilege?
Absolutely.
I think there's a balance between the idea of universal white privilege, and it doesn't exist.
That now we have to be a voice as white people.
About it, African American women last year changed the course of this nation. Women are the backbone, and now we need to support the souls that they stand on.
And now, whether you're folding laundry, driving, exercising, or cooking, grab your favorite deli sandwich or bagel and your favorite beverage, and let's do this together in the Sports Deli. Auntie, take us away. We're so honored to welcome, just 3 days away from Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the pride of Syracuse, New York, and Jamesville DeWitt High School, Danny Schayes. He played his college ball at Syracuse, where he didn't start until his senior year, but he was first team All Big East and is a perfect example of the saying in sports, it's not how you start, but how you finish. And because he finished his Syracuse career in such strong fashion, he was selected in the 1981 NBA draft by the then Utah Jazz with the 13th overall pick of the first round. To that point, he went on to play in the NBA for 7 different teams over the course of 18 seasons and played in 1,138 games, which is an average of 63 out of 82 games per year. His father, Dolph Schayes, I digress, was voted as one of the 50 greatest players of all time and was voted into the Naismith Hall of Fame in 1972 when I was 3 years old. But as Danny explained in SheridanHoops.com in 2016, that really doesn't explain the true influence that his dad had on him and on the history of basketball. I highly recommend you go to SheridanHoops.com and check out the piece Danny wrote about his father. But a couple of interesting facts about his dad that I wanted to share. First, he started a Final Four game in college at the age of 16. He scored the first basket in NBA All-Star game history. He played in 706 consecutive games over a 9-year stretch. Load management, my ass. And he once broke his wrist on his shooting hand and became a left-handed shooter. And he was a player coach during his last year in the league and coached Wilt Chamberlain. But more than that, Danny said his dad was an even better person who always put family first. His father was constantly seeking new ways to improve his game and would often shoot his free throws into a 14-inch diameter hoop, which was 4 inches smaller than a regulation hoop, similar to the one you might find at a carnival. And this tactic helped him lead the NBA in free throw percentage not once, not twice, but 3 times. But the real question is, did Danny do the same thing, as he was a career 80% free throw shooter himself? He shares a birthday with Chris Berman and was born the same year as Lawrence Taylor, John McEnroe, Florence Griffith Joyner, Magic Johnson, Simon Cowell, and none other than Weird Al Yankovic. He won a gold medal in the 77 and 81 Maccabee games in Israel, which I'm thinking about trying out for the 45 and over team for next year's Maccabee games in Israel. And for those of you that don't know, this is the Jewish Olympics, for which I tried out as a youth 3 times and got cut every time. He then won another gold medal some 33 years later, but this time as a head coach in 2013. He played with Adrian Dantley, Kiki Vandeweghe, Jay Vincent, Sam's brother, who was on our show, Jack Sikma, Chocolate Thunder, James Worthy, Kurt Rambis, fellow Orangeman Billy Owens, Charles Barkley, and Sam Bowie, who was drafted 1 slot ahead of Michael Jordan. He's the former executive director of the National Basketball Retired Players Association. He's worked for ESPN and TNT, just to name a few. He wrote the book Fast Broke, not to be confused with Fast Break, Mike Lupica's book. Learn the real reason athletes go broke so you don't have to. He's co-hosted a show and still does pregame, as you heard earlier, with the Syracuse Orangemen for the basketball program in New York with Etan Thomas, an influencer and former NBA player who was also on our show. And he currently works for Rico USA. You can find him on LinkedIn. Danny, truly, like I said, that was a long one, but it was, man, honored to have you in the Sports Deli where everyone deserves a seat at the table. Welcome.
Mike, I got to admit, that could be the most thorough, complete intro in history. And thank you for that. So couple of fast facts.
Yeah.
I believe due to politically correctness, we're now just the Syracuse Orange. I don't think we're allowed to be Orangemen anymore.
That's a good point.
So I think it's just now Orange. And
cool.
we've been through, since I went there, we've been through at least 3 mascots. We started with the Saltine Warrior, which was an Indian warrior, and that got kaputted.
Right.
Then they moved him to a Greek warrior because the fraternity council supplied the mascot guy. That got kaputted. Now we have Otto the Orange. He's an actual orange, if you know. But we have a fierce Otto too. So there's a specific version that's fierce Otto. So it's hard to make an orange fierce. And it's, growing up in Syracuse, as you can imagine, there aren't a lot of orange fields, or orange trees. But anyway, so Otto is the official guy. And you mentioned finishing is better than starting. I still have the trivia question as the longest tenured NBA player ever from Syracuse. For all the greats that came through, although I'm about to be passed by Carmelo Anthony, maybe one of the greatest Syracuse player ever, at least in that conversation with Dave Bing, Derek Coleman, a few of the others. So I'm very proud to my boy Melo is going to take the mantle, and so it was a great run.
Yeah, we'll definitely want to talk about Syracuse and Coach Boeheim and his legacy. I used to work the Syracuse camps back in the 90s. And so, man, I have vivid memories of those. Those are so much fun, and playing games in the evening and running the stairs and a lot of stairs.
Exactly. So so again, we'll talk a little history. So you mentioned my dad as a pioneer in the game. Well, one of the things that he also pioneered, he started the second basketball camp in America. Wow. He and Bob Cousy started camps in 1951. Coos is a little bit ahead, so my dad's number 2. And as a high schooler and college player, Jim Boeheim was a counselor at the Dolph Schayes All-Star Camp.
Wow.
In whatever year that would have been, 60-something.
Right.
And so I was a camper, obviously grew up every year. So he owned a summer camp facility, was part owner up in the northeast part of the state near Lake George. And it was a summer sleepaway camp. And so I spent every summer of my life in the Adirondacks. And then the 9th week, 8 weeks camp, 9th week was basketball only, 200 kids out in the woods playing basketball 12 hours a day. And my wife still cracks up because every time we run into somebody who went there, first words out of their mouth is, "That was the best time of my life." And she goes, "Dude, you're 50. I mean, nothing better happened since you were 50. And like, oh, the best time of my life. And so that's Jimmy and I go back that far since he was a camp counselor at my dad's camp back in the Adirondacks.
Oh, that's amazing. So your grandfather was a truck driver for a laundry company. Is that right?
Yeah, came over in the 20s as a teenager. Actually was a boxer in Romania, in Western Romania, but ended up having a bad accident, got frostbite, and his feet were disabled. Could still walk, but killed his boxing career. And as most immigrants of that era, he came across and he had to learn English. Did not have an advanced education, so worked labor jobs and drove a truck for laundry. Put his 3 kids through college. Wow. And my dad's an interesting story because from him I not only learned basketball, but also a love of learning. So my dad did an amazing thing. And in his era, he actually skipped 2 grades of high school, grew up in the Bronx, went to DeWitt Clinton High School, an elite high school, and ended up skipping 2 grades and left school. He graduated as in the middle of his junior year, what would have been his junior year, and left the team that was was going for the city championship, which back then in the 40s was it. I mean,
Right.
that was might as well been the national championship.
Right.
Left school in the middle of the season, went to enrolled in NYU, New York University, and they were a powerhouse, which
Right.
is how he ended up playing in the Final Four at 16. And then got a engineering degree at NYU in 3 years. So at 19, he was already in the NBA with an 4-year engineering degree from NYU. Very different path than one and done, which gets you to 19 in today's era.
Yeah.
But in his era, tall and skinny, 6'8", back in the 40s was a big deal. And again, 3 brothers in a 1-bedroom apartment. You wanted to be out doing stuff. So for him, it was basketball. Actually, his younger brother Herman also played college basketball and ended up playing for the against the Globetrotters for a while,
Right.
and then playing some other. Back then, they barnstormed because remember the NBA. My dad's college career predated the NBA. The NBA was officially formed in 49. He came out of school in 48, although they officially go back to 46 when it was there were 2 leagues back then, the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, and the NBL, the National Basketball League. And one was the big cities, the New Yorks, Philly had the Warriors, Celtics, and then the others, of course, the small cities that was in the other leagues, Syracuse,
Yeah.
Rochester, Oshkosh, Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so when they merged in 49, that's when the NBA was officially named. Although, like I said, they coined their first, they go back to 46 as the founding of that strain of the league. So that was an amazing era back then. You talk about, my dad playing 700 games with no load management. They didn't even have trainers,
Right.
let alone, they're playing with Chuck Taylors. Didn't get your
Right.
ankles taped, didn't get, you rode the train to games. It predated air travel. And which is why the league could only go as far west as Minneapolis, because it was just too unwieldy to travel to the West Coast. So it wasn't until the 60s when air travel was popular enough that they could put 2 teams out west, when obviously the Lakers moved from Minneapolis and Philadelphia Warriors moved and became San Francisco. And then my dad's team in Syracuse moved down to Philadelphia and became the 76ers. So that's how that little shuffle happened. And as you mentioned, he made the NBA's top 50, but a little lesser known fact, they actually had a silver anniversary team, a top 25. And so back in that era, my dad was also on that silver anniversary team. There was only 12. And so this year, amazingly, they're coming up with a top 75.
Right. Yeah.
So we're looking forward to seeing how that turns out.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. So those last 5 or 6 spots is definitely going to be interesting.
Well, so many great players in the league today. And
Yeah.
I know when the top 50 came out, even back then, they still had a hard time with institutional memory. How do you compare Dick McGuire or a
Right.
Dolph Schayes or a Bob or a Bill Sharman against a Jordan and those guys? So it's an amazing exercise, but
Right.
it's going to be interesting.
Definitely going to be interesting. So you mentioned that your dad had a love of learning, and it reminds me of when Steve Lavin came on, and he talked about his father and his love of learning, what he taught him, and John Wooden, and his love of learning, doing a deep dive at 99 years old into the common themes with religions, and so really that's what it's about. I think if you're going to be the best version of yourself, is to continue to learn, and this continuous process of this ever-changing world, which has been flipped upside down the last year and a half. And so to that point, we're both Jewish. I talked about this with Don Kogis, who was on this week also, about, family structures matter in terms of how we see the world, how we feel empowered, how we're taught to go out and just attack the world head on. And a lot of people haven't had that opportunity. And so talk a little bit about that, because, you're a couple generations made sacrifices for you. And, we don't want to oversimplify what you just talked about, because it runs a lot deeper than that. But talk about, a little bit more of your upbringing and some of the family things that you have great memories of. Sports Deli is sponsored by SportRx, the leader in sport prescription eyewear. You can find them online at sportrx.com. And don't forget to enter the code DELI10 at checkout for your special 10% discount. And now back to this incredible interview right here on the Sports Deli.
When they talk about turning points in life, right? So as I mentioned, my grandpa Carl came over from Romania in the 20s, had to learn English and work labor to married, actually my grandmother, his wife, they grew up 2 miles apart in Romania, but met in New York City.
Oh my gosh.
Interestingly enough, as teenagers, 3 boys. And again, putting them through college. This is, during the war years.
Right.
So very difficult time. My dad at 6'8" was too tall for the war and was a few years too young. The older brother, Freddie, was in the Army, but never was posted overseas. And so when he came out of college, again, as I mentioned, there were the 2 leagues, the BAA and the NBL. Right. So my dad was drafted both by the Knicks in the territorial rights and by Syracuse in the regular draft. So he actually was able to ignite a bidding war, as we say laughingly. The Knicks wouldn't go over $5,000 a year, and Syracuse went all the way up to $7,500. So for $2,500, which they all say that was a lot of money in 1948. I grew up in Syracuse instead of New York. And so that was a turning point. My dad talks about getting off the bus in Syracuse and not knowing a soul up there. And actually the team miscommunicated, didn't even meet him at the bus station. He actually had to walk over to the stadium, again, but this is, NBA in its infancy.
Right.
So when I grew up, it was, essentially I used to joke Richie Cunningham could have grew up down the street, from the old Happy Days character, the Ron Howard show. Yep. Just, average middle class, public school, played in the band, played a couple sports. And as far as, Jewish heritage, was involved in the local synagogue, et cetera, but never really had a true connection to Judaism until the aforementioned Maccabee games. To me, back then, Judaism was really kind of an intellectual thing. You learned about it. You were a Jewish kid. I went to in the area I grew up in, had a strong Jewish presence. It certainly wasn't a Jewish area, but it was probably 20% Jewish. So it was strong presence, and it was a very very equal opportunity, giving community. We went to the communions, the other kids came to the bar mitzvahs. It was, for my neighbor down the street would invite me down to help decorate the Christmas tree. And, it was just a very, very strong community. Nothing could even be considered, competition or, anything like that. In 77, my senior year of high school, my dad ended up being the head coach of the open team for the World Maccabee Games. This, as you mentioned, it's actually the 3rd largest sporting event in the world, held every 4 years in Israel, the year after the Olympics. Yeah. And it's a full Olympic event, just all Jewish players and athletes. The U.S. actually sends a bigger team to the Maccabee Games than the Olympics, interestingly enough. So, and the whole idea of the games is to experience Israel through sports and really get in touch with Jewish heritage. So I went over thinking I was going to an athletic competition, and ended up, for just over 2 weeks, being able to embed in Israel, tour the sites, meet families, and have an incredible competition. So one quick side story: back in '77, Israel was led by a U.S. player named Tal Brody, the Israeli national team. And Israel, of course, was a relatively new country, founded in the 40s. It was only 30 years old at that time, and so still new, still deserty, still being built, still have that pioneer spirit. And that summer in '77, Tal Brody led the Israeli national team to their first ever European championship. There's a great movie made about it called On the Map. And Tal Brody, the famous quote after they won. He was interviewed and he said, "Israel is finally on the map in sports and in everything." And that was a huge turning point. This is the spring of '77, huge turning point in Israeli sports history. And in many ways, Israeli history itself. The game was so big that the prime minister was resigning in scandal, and they couldn't find a TV crew because everybody was covering the game. And so he had to hold off his, it's an amazing story. He had to hold off his resignation until the next day because there was no one to watch him resign because everyone was watching the Israeli team win the European Cup. Oh my God. And so the reason I bring that up is that summer was us playing, the U.S. team playing in the Maccabee games against most of the remnants of that national team. Tal had retired, and there was another player, All-C Perry. Their center was an American, so he couldn't play. And we ended up bringing over our team, and we had a fantastic team at the time. Lots of major college players: Stu Clytenic from South Carolina, Brian Magid from University of Maryland, Joel Kramer, who UC San Diego. San Diego State played with Syracuse or with the Suns. So we had a terrific team and ended up beating Willie Sims, played at LSU. We ended up beating them at the buzzer in somewhere between the greatest game and the greatest scandal in Maccabee history. There wasn't anything untoward, but just because that team came in and we were the upstart Americans who thought we owned basketball and the sellout crowd cheering. I mean, it was one of the most amazing games I've ever played in.
Oh,
And but because of that experience, and I'm kind of telling the story in a big circle,
yeah.
But because of that experience, both from experiencing Israel at that time, being embedded, seeing the country up close, meeting the people, and walking the opening ceremonies, playing in that game, it was just such an impactful time, and really embedded in me what it means to be Jewish, what it means to what Israel means to the world, et cetera. So those games were just an incredible turning point.
Wow, that's fascinating. You talked about being a pioneer, and the one question I had was, because we've talked about this with other people, it's a little bit different era, but was street ball a thing back when you were playing? Because I know in Detroit, and Jim Herrick talked about this when he came on.
Mm-hmm.
He said we would go into the black neighborhoods and the blacks would come into the white neighborhoods.
Sure.
No one said a word, and we just did it because we wanted a ball. Was that a thing with you up there?
Absolutely.
Sports Deli is sponsored by Moolah Kicks. Moolah is MOOLAH, like money, moolah, and kicks like shoes, one word. You can find them online at moolahkicks.com. And it's the first ever female-only brand basketball shoe. So it's a shout out to the basketball street culture, and it is also about fighting social injustice and gender inequality worldwide and here in the United States. And again, you can find them at moolahkicks.com. And now back to this incredible interview right here in the Sports Deli.
Now, I grew up in Syracuse, so it wasn't New York City.
Yeah.
But we played schoolyard. There wasn't AAU, there wasn't all that summer stuff. So we played schoolyard, and it wasn't unusual for, you go and some guy's knife falls out of his gym bag or so,
Wow.
in your or whatever. And, but basketball was Switzerland, right? When, as you mentioned, you come in, we're just balling, having fun, and playing hard. Believe me, it was fight to the death, because you didn't want to sit out. That was probably the theme you heard over and over. You didn't want to lose,
right?
And you had to get 4 games back in line. So it was
people were
tough
playing hard. Yeah,
it was tough to score the game winner, and you had to finish in traffic. I mean, because you were getting hacked, right? And if you called too many fouls, you were a sissy. It wasn't like,
well, especially you were a big, you're calling a foul. You're a little punk.
Exactly. You had to earn it, and but it was great ball. And remember the era in the NBA, the ABA NBA merger had recently happened, 76. Right. I came in 81, and so the NBA was full of ABA players who were the street ball version, right? The NBA was historically the Midwestern white guys, Indiana, Kentucky, that slow, methodical kind of game, and the ABA was the street ball game, right? Run and gun, dunk contest, flash, that kind of thing. So when they merged, most of what you love about the NBA came from the ABA, the high tempo, the 3-point line, dunking, trash talking, the swagger, all that was ABA. And when I came in, all the ABA stars were still playing. George Gervin, Van Issel, Artis Gilmore, Mose Malone, on and on. So the 4 teams with ABA roots, Denver was one where I played, still had ABA roots. You went down to San Antonio, and it was ABA fans. It was that raucous, go at it. So it was a fantastic time. And so the whole street ball mentality was all the way up through the NBA.
Man, that is amazing. I just can't get enough of those stories, no matter who comes on and talks about it, especially the old school players like you and me and Don and Jim. And, when they tell their stories, it's amazing how sports and locker rooms are so far ahead of society, and what we can learn from sports, if we just sort of took a look at it as a framework for, how to find some middle ground, we'd be a lot better off for sure. So, I talk about this a lot, but Jay Bilas, on the one hand, had a really bad high school experience, and he's been pretty open about it. And his wife even called him on it and said, you and your teammates were pretty scarred by that experience because obviously, you said that he was probably a good person off the court. He was just in over his head and, just didn't know what he was getting himself into. And as a result, it just wasn't a good coach. And, you overcame it, but a lot of people don't overcome it. And so what's the message to coaches? Because there's coaches that listen to this show, and we're in a different time now. It's not shut up and dribble. It's not, get in someone's face in the old days, or, it's a different time. And so we have to find that delicate balance between, challenging, and we have a different mentality. We have an old school mentality, but we have an instant gratification kid now, who's swiping left and right and up and down. And so how do we find that delicate balance? What type of tools can we help these kids put in their toolbox? Sports Deli is sponsored by PSK. You can find them online at lids.com, pskcollective.com, tjmax.com, walmart.com, and now Kohl's department store at kohls.com. And now back to this incredible interview right here in the Sports Deli.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I get the question so often, how has the game changed? Most people recognize easily the impact of the 3-point line, right?
Well, we know how the game's changed.
No, I'm getting that.
Yeah.
But what drove the game to change in so many ways is not just the game, the rules, but also the mentality. So when I played in the 80s, it was the highest scoring era in NBA history. Right. And but if you look at the rule package back then, right, guards could hand check, which means you could stiff arm as a defender.
Right.
You could put your hand on a guy's hip and push him all over the court back then. It wasn't a foul.
Yeah.
Bigs could root guys out of the post. There was no such thing as flagrant fouls. We had 2 refs. Game was super physical. You talk about the Jordan rules, right? When Jordan drove to the basket, the goal was to see how high he could bounce when you threw him on the ground. And so we played in an era that was that physical, and the reason the scores were high is you had to move the ball, move the people, play a passing game style, or else you just get held and pushed.
Right.
And so what happened was, the dominant teams back then were obviously the Lakers and the Celtics. The Lakers were Showtime, so all the Western teams had to play high tempo because you had to somehow beat the Lakers to advance in the playoffs. East was the Celtics, so you had to play big physical, move the ball. So you saw Philadelphia, you saw New York making specific trades to match up against the Celtic players.
Right.
And then, so the game was high tempo because the dominant teams were high tempo. Now what's happened is then the bad boys took over, right? They decided to slow the game down, what we used to call walk the dog, and on offense. And so the games went into the 90s and the 80s. So, and because they won, every team said, well, that's how you win. So now the game got slow. So the NBA had to now change the rules. You couldn't hold, you couldn't push, you couldn't hand check, couldn't do all those things. And so, so the game changed a lot because of that. And then as the other thing that happened is the development cycle shortened. When I came in the league, it was rare for a player not to be a 4-year college player. My year, the first 3 picks were underclassmen, and you think the world was going to end, right? And now,
right.
Almost nobody goes 4 years, right? And so when the development cycle changed, and the AAU kind of took over for development, then what happened is that whole instant gratification thing started because players were getting recruited younger and younger. They were looked to be scorers younger and younger. They didn't learn the game in that way. They learned the game as an individual, not as a team, because they didn't play year after year on teams. So the nature of the skill set changed. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the whole instant gratification cycle came in. There were less, like team roots, right? Team became less important. I got to get mine became more important.
Yeah.
And so that now you had to coach to that. You mentioned in your face coaching. In my era, getting MF'd on national TV in front of your mother was nothing. That was how it worked. Hubie Brown used to get in fist fights in practice. They'd roll around and dust off and, okay, let's go play. Nothing, And but that was the nature of the relationship, but you didn't take it personally. Doug Moe, who one of the great coaches, had anger issues, and he used to joke about it. He says, hey, 22 hours a day, nicest guy in the world. Do I throw the ball up? He's cussing everybody. He just goes nuts because you just got to put up with me. That's just the way it is. And then he'd buy you beer after and, never hold a grudge. So So that, that whole kind of mentality relationship. Now, fast forward 20 years, my old teammate Brian Shaw gets the head coaching job with the Nuggets. Brian, longtime player, longtime coach.
Yep.
And he's a young guy at the time, right? Probably 40, early 40s. Yep. And I run into him one day and he's just like, he's beaten, depressed. I go, Brian, what's going on? He goes, I don't know how to talk to kids today. He said, I had to buy a book on millennials, how to talk to millennials, so I could understand what they were doing. I mean, I'd yell at a guy in practice and the agent would call me in 15 minutes. I'm like, how do you even know I'm yelling at the guy in practice? But, and
Wow.
So it's the whole entitlement thing really shifted as the pot of gold got bigger and bigger. The whole, the entitlement, I got to get mine, got bigger and bigger, and it got younger and younger. And so as players came up, they, like I said, didn't have that development. They didn't have the mentoring. They didn't have the wait your turn, and so a lot of those kind of things that were built into our era, had just transformed. Not saying whether it's, a better or worse. I mean, you look at what LeBron's done for the league, not only as a player, but as a person, man in the community, starting schools and having impact and mentoring for a guy who never went to college, right? So Kobe, another one. You look at the impact he had but you could see the way he developed was way different. Coming in as a brash 18-year-old and going through that, the public development cycle he went through, and it wasn't until he was, later years, 35 plus that he, really
being a girl dad
became the Kobe that is now the revered, man of the world. And so, so it's interesting how that has really played into it. Obviously, from a basketball standpoint, the 3-point line has taken over the game, and it's there's no more inside out. There's no more throw it in the center. My era, we used to joke the dinosaurs ruled the earth, right? Every team had a dominant center, ball would go in. When I came in, there were 10, 20,000 point centers playing at the same time, right? And teams they were all center dominant, inside out.
Yeah.
And now it's the opposite. I don't know if there's 3 centers in the league, let alone
not on the men's side. On the women's side there is, but not on the men's side.
So so that's just that's just a natural evolution of the game. When my dad played in his era, it was mostly what he used to call hot potato basketball, passing game. High tempo, move the ball, move the people, again, because you could grab and foul and hold and do all that.
It's amazing because now if you do that, you're deferring.
Well, I mean, if you hard foul a guy coming across the lane, they stop the game, they view it, you get a flagrant, you get thrown out, you get fined $50,000, and you're like, I watch the games now and they're stopping the game for a flagrant foul. I'm like, flagrant? It's just a foul. I mean,
that's right. You can hear Mark Jackson and Jeff, and they're just like, come on, that's just a common foul. Like, come on.
The pendulum, from that standpoint, the pendulum has swung so far. And the other way the pendulum has swung is, obviously the global nature of the game has changed it. When you talk about from a cultural standpoint, 20+% of the players are international now. So that brings a brand new element. The game is designed to be marketed overseas. You look at the China influence on the game. So I think that, it's hard to look at the game without taking that into account. As you look at where the game is socially today, with the internet generation, with social media generation, actually, now it's several generations. I think maybe Chris Bosh was the first one to, back in the day, really take on social media as a thing. But now it's, 24/7, if it doesn't exist on social media, it never happened, so, the social media influence has played such a impactful part, even down to the, the name, image, likeness thing you're seeing come through now. That's all driven by social media. Yeah. And again, you can debate, good or bad, plus or minus, but it's, it does have a huge influence on the game.
So speaking of name, image, and likeness, fair to say you had a good high school experience. Having said all of that, a lot of it was because your dad, and you just, no matter what coaches you had, your dad was going to probably supersede all of that, and the influence that he had on you and your family's influence probably. Sports Deli is sponsored by City Lokes, CITYLOCS. You can find them online at citylokes.com. where you can go and make your own personalized license plate hats. They're so cool. You got to check them out. And don't forget to enter the code TheSportsDeli at checkout for your special 10% discount. And now back to this incredible interview right here in the Sports Deli.
Well, he did only from a
introductory standpoint.
Well, only from a reputation standpoint. He
Okay.
didn't physically get involved except for yelling at the refs, which was a passion of his. But I was fortunate to have good coaches.
Okay.
Kind of growing up, and I did my whole area. Not only the coach from my high school, JV and varsity, but also the coaches we played against. Actually, most of them were counselors at my dad's camp. Because back then the coaching level at basketball camps was way higher than it is today because of NCAA rules. So every coach at the camp was a high school varsity or a college assistant. Now you can't do that because it's a recruiting violation. But I was fortunate to have very good coaching growing up through my dad's basketball camp and through my high school. So cross fingers, knock on wood, whatever you want. That I did have a very good experience.
Did you have players of color on your team, on your high school team?
No. We had 2 black kids in my high school.
Wow.
They were identical twins named Pierce and Pierre and played the saxophone.
You still talk to them?
Actually, I'm on Facebook with one of them. No, we don't talk much, but we do connect. Yeah. And but what's ironic is that it wasn't an issue. I mean, I don't really know how to explain it, but I never had a negative experience growing up with anyone of color. So I never had an issue. I never had wasn't even a conversation, I mean, there wasn't any.
Well, that language of basketball a lot of times will put you in that bubble.
And so for me, when it was probably, kind of high school age, playing against other schools and playing at camps and, going to 5-star, which was one of the few places outside of town to go 5-star basketball camp. That I, really spent, a lot of time in the black community, and then obviously college and pro. But again, to me, it was never in my consciousness one way or the other. So it was never a thing even to look at. I see it, in my experience back then, from a racial relationship as being night and day what I see today. Where, again, maybe I was the naive one. But I never saw race as even a thing to talk about outside of just the obvious, And I played, like we used to joke around when I was in Denver. We had a couple of Southern players, T.R. Dunn from Alabama, Alex English from South Carolina. And when we go on the road, like we played a preseason game in Columbia for Alex English Day. And Mom had us over for a Southern dinner, so chitlins and barbecue and that. And it was just hoot and holler and wow, this is really cool. Thanks for the experience. It wasn't and it was nothing but family friendly, like that. So, and we used to, again, T.R. Dunn, great friend, Alabama. I went to the University of Alabama and, we used to, make all this, we used to just joke back and forth, nothing, and you mentioned earlier about a lot of sports locker rooms, right? Probably the most un-PC places on the planet.
Right.
And anything was open game, and that's why the code is it stays in the locker room, right? Because there's an understanding of, what's allowed in a sports locker room, wouldn't exist in the street with media, with, that kind of take everything out of context mentality. And, but, every possible insult, rag on everybody. Right. Hey, if you show up and your pants are an inch too short, you're going to hear about it. If you say something stupid, you're going to hear about it. If, your road girl is ugly, man, are you going to hear about it? So it's, it was supernatural how un-PC locker rooms are. And again, but nothing is ever taken, it's just, it's just trash talk, right? Or fun or whatever. There's the understanding of it that it's not like, I'm not really insulting you. We're hooting and hollering, right? And I'm making fun of your this or your that, or your, and vice versa. And, it's practical jokes or whatever you want, however you want to do it. It's just it is what it is. Yeah. I still do radio for Syracuse and pregame shows, that kind of things. And I did a daily talk show before COVID. So I have my, my like I got my set with all my, trophies, memorabilia in the background.
Yeah,
so
that's awesome.
Here it's a little noisy.
Can't hear one thing, no ambient sound at all.
in that case, perfect. So
My communication advisor would be very proud of me that I used the word ambient during this interview, since I am
like
a
it.
communication major, and you'd be impressed with that also, since Syracuse is renowned for their.
absolutely.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Short story is I went to Syracuse as a chemistry major, and it turned out that a Newhouse grad, right, the school, fresh out of college, bought this little 5,000 watt FM, and he had a Sunday night guest DJ, where you'd write in and do guest
Absolutely.
DJ spots. So big fan. So he came to me one day at practice, and he's 24 years old. He says, "Hey, you want to be, being another player, do the guest DJ spot one night." So Sunday night was rolled out to this just, pissant little nothing booth in the middle of nowhere in Manlius, New York, and we used to joke, you had to sit in the parking lot to get the station. And I loved it. The other guy hated it, so he gave me a show. So Schayes Lounge was born, and so I did a show for him for my last year there, and then I ended up getting a rock show in Denver. I was a rock DJ in Denver when I was there for 2 years, and did tons of radio. Now that same little pissant guy is the 600-pound gorilla in New York. He owns the station that is the Syracuse flagship. Yeah, he does Yankees outside of New York. And so when we went in the ACC, he called me back up and said, "Hey, I need some horsepower. You've got a show. So come on, do all my pregame, and then we'll look about doing some more." So, so that's how I got my start, as a rock DJ in good old Manlius, 1978.
Man, that is fascinating. Oh,
So
I love it. That's so cool. What do you think of when you see Doc Rivers crying at the podium, or LeBron saying that, he's still fearful for his kids, in a time where, unfortunately, the death of somebody, in this case, George Floyd, sheds a light, when the conversations should just happen naturally if somebody's concerned, instead of being dismissive or marginalizing, a culture or, people's experiences, even if they have different ones, in terms of the same culture, because people will say, "Well, LeBron, whatever, like you're and so there's been more white allies from what I've noticed than ever before. And so maybe back then when we were growing up, it was more, we just didn't talk about it. It was just, like you said, locker room and whatever, and no one thought anything of it. But what are your thoughts in terms of, do you sense a shift going on? Do you think there's going to be more policy changes, or is it going to get swept under the carpet? Do you think sports has done a good job? Like, what are your thoughts on all of what's happened last year and a half?
Well, this is really an interesting kind of place to wade into, and it's also a very difficult place to have an honest conversation about, frankly. And because again, everything is so overly, I wouldn't say overly, everything is so sensitized right now. Like for instance, I think the last statistic I heard is that there were some small number, 10 or 12 or 14 deaths in custody of unarmed African Americans in police custody. Yet that is the issue when there's thousands of gang-related deaths in the African community or in the African American community, and on and on and on. So if you look at the scope of the problem, or the issue itself, it seems that there's a huge amount of capital spent on this issue compared to drug overdoses, which kill 1,000 times as many, or black on black crime, or gang related issues which kill 1,000 times as many. So what that means to me is this represents something bigger than the issue. Like this, I see that as a trigger of what else is going on, of that deep-seated angst, deep-seated pain in the Black community. And this is kind of what triggered it to come out. And it almost seems like there's like different perceptions of conversations. So for instance, LeBron said something that I thought was very courageous. He did an interview, and I'm going to paraphrase. I think it was The Barbershop was the name of the show. And he talked about when he was growing up, all he heard was that whites were oppressors and evil and et cetera, et cetera. That's all he heard his entire life. Never met a white person until he went to high school, and he was recruited to an elite high school. And only then did he actually meet an actual white person, where he got to see that wasn't true. But it begs the question, how much of that, however you want to say it, program or message or recurring theme, that system, that reinforced system, is being programmed into inner city communities that now, are being exposed, right? Another thing that came out that I found very interesting, and it kind of came and went pretty quickly, but the African American History Museum put out a thing on white traits. I don't know if you saw this, and if you look at it, most of what they defined as white traits were success principles, right? It was deferring gratification, stress education, family unit,
Right.
Saving money, working your way up the corporate ladder, a lot of these things and I'm reading this and I'm kind of perplexed at how did these become white traits? Like, what's white about them? They talk about the European culture kind of brought it over, and I'm like, okay, but
instead of what? Just things that would deem
they're just
you successful.
Things you do to become successful, right?
Right.
But here's the part that triggered me on it, is one of the things that I've heard over and over, and again, this is just me as an observer, but when somebody from the city becomes successful and they move out to the suburbs, they're tagged as going white, and that's a bad thing. You saw it with Tiger Woods, you saw it with Michael Jordan, you saw it with that they're going white. Like, that's an evil thing to have happen. And so if you start connecting the messaging, right? So when I put these things together, one of the things that just kind of occurred to me is if these are established to be white people things and going white is a bad thing, then what's left, right? I mean, this is just being successful. This is getting an education, climbing the socioeconomic ladder. The European, like when I talked about my family's path, that the normal path back for the immigrant community was a 2-generation path. The first generation would come in, they'd work, an unskilled labor, they'd learn something, put their kids through college, and generation 3 were my generation were the kids who grew up with the expectation you go to college, that you get an education, and blah blah blah. So that was the path, and and I just find it so intriguing that the way this the angst has been triggered by the George Floyd incident that has brought so much to the surface that obviously is there. I mean, I'm in no way diminishing or making it not real. I mean, it's real, and so the question is, how do we make this a communication without having it lead to real division? I mean, like I said, I see way more division now than when I was playing back 30 years ago, where, like I said, it was where basketball was the agnostic thing, right? It was the meritocracy. You could play or you couldn't, and it had nothing to do with a race element or. And then, like I said, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, and I'm sure that there were racial issues, but I don't see it anything compared to where we are today.
Oh, well, that was probably an answer that we haven't heard before on the show. That's far from an oversimplification. I think that speaks to the multi-layers that is involved in this issue, and there are family structure issues. We're probably not ones to speak on black issues. Rashawn McLeod came on the show, and he talked about the fact that there are those issues, but we're specifically talking about the systemic things. And one of the things I heard on Clubhouse this morning that I found very interesting is a very successful person who was in jail for 3 years, a person of color, said, not only do we not see people like us in successful situations growing up oftentimes, but we don't even start to think in a way that allows us to understand that we could be successful. So we stop ourselves. It's like there's an instant sabotage, which I didn't really think of, when someone says, oh, you could do this or you could do that. And you're like, and then all of a sudden they're like, they instantly shoot it down. And so that thought process doesn't even evolve. And they just continue down that other path, wherever that leads oftentimes. And like you said, it's layered. There's a lot of internal issues and there obviously are policy issues that need to be changed, and there's disproportionate things that are going on. But I mean, from my perspective, I don't know how you feel, but I feel like the NBA and all the major sports collabed in a way that I hadn't seen before, where people aren't either ostracized or they're, and you can go back, like you mentioned, Dave Bing and Arthur Ashes and the Kareems. And there's been a lot of people, Colin, most recently, Bruce Maxwell. Bruce Maxwell was on the show, Major League Baseball player. Same thing happened to him, first black baseball player to kneel. And so, now you're encouraged to speak out, whether it was the NCAA issue with the women or whatever it is that's going on. Because if you don't, people will have your back now. You're not going to have sponsorships taken away. So there's been a shift from that perspective where people are going to have your back, and the owners and coaches and, people in leadership positions, still white men who run all these big conglomerates, there's a lot of pressure on them.
There is. And the flip side of that is, I'll be probably more candid than I should here, but I think the NBA was exposed in Hong Kong, for instance, that they talk about social justice, but there's the perception that until the bread is not buttered anymore, and then it's not an issue. So I think there's a thing there that the NBA has never addressed or figured out. I think that even in my era. The great social justice leaders, the Kareem Jabbars, Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, they had to be big enough stars where they could, be beyond retribution. Obviously, even Muhammad Ali wasn't big enough, but he didn't have anything behind him because he was a solo athlete, unlike a Kareem or a Jim Brown. But those guys had a level of courage to go out at a time where it wasn't celebrated, and even. It trickles down to simple things like running the NBA union. When it came time for collective bargaining, the union wanted a president who was beyond retribution. So when Patrick Ewing was the president, they needed a star big enough to not be pressured. So there was that element of the great civil rights leaders, but it was always a kind of a step forward. And the league itself always had the position of being in some ways. I don't know if agnostic's the right way to put it, or just a kind of actually, I'll phrase it a different way. In today's world where social justice is everywhere and everything, and again, not just an observation, right? Sports was always thought of as a place where that didn't apply, where you could play or you couldn't. It was meritocracy. It was, certainly an opportunity. If you talk about the African American community, it was something that had 100% access if you could play. Right, there was never an issue of that level of discrimination. So it's now that the league itself has become so public about it, there's also the perception of, look, is there any place I can go to watch a basketball game? Right, I want to enjoy the sports. I want to cheer my team on. I want to have that be a not. Like an island of I can go have fun doing this. So there's it's finding its level, right? There's the pendulum is swinging obviously, but there's really a case of it needing to find its level.
Well, we could talk about that for a long time. Wow, that's fascinating stuff. I appreciate your thoughtfulness when it comes to talking about that. Because we understand it, right? Being descendants of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and you probably learned more about that even when you went to Israel, and
Sure.
we have a different level of sensitivity. I know more about my history. Over the last year, my 92-year-old grandmother spent 6 months here and talked about her family and the history of her family. It's just so we understand things a little bit differently, I think.
And Mike, let me jump this in, because before we wrap here, I did want to kind of mention this, because this is kind of another thing from a personal level that I find ineffective and annoying. This concept of there's like a white community or a black community, like it's uniform, right? I mean, when you talk about the years of the European immigration, it's not like there was one type of European, like Europeans got along. Right. The Italians were at war, the French and the English, the Irish were discriminated against, then there's the Eastern Bloc. So it's not like there's any kind of standard, of white culture, European culture, and the same thing in the African American community. Right. It's not like there's a standard type black experience. And so what I see being talked about is confusing culture with color. And that's the part that I think makes a lot of the conversation, it's sometimes difficult or ineffective, because there's I see what's talked about as racial issues as much as cultural and economic issues, right? You talk about that poor mentality that you brought up a few minutes ago. That's a way different thing than just the African American experience, and raising people from poverty, in the generation we talked about, the post First and Second War, people had to be raised from poverty. They lived in ethnic ghettos when they came across. There was an Italian neighborhood, a Polish neighborhood, a Irish neighborhood, and they had to work their way out of those ghetto situations to advance. And so I see that as maybe a more effective conversation than just making it the people of color versus the people of not color. Like those are uniform things.
Yeah. Can I ask you a few of the rapid fire questions before we wrap things up? Okay, good, man. Great talk. Maybe next time we'll talk about Coach. And, Coach K obviously is retiring, and Coach Boeheim, I don't know how much time he's got left, but obviously he's had an amazing run. And, I know this pandemic took its toll on a lot of the coaches probably. Mm-hmm. Today's giveaway is compliments of PSK. Be inspired in PSK. That is Phaedra Knight's line of clothing that promotes inclusivity, empowerment, and equality by supporting female athletes through the Women's Sports Foundation. She's in the Rugby Hall of Fame. And so it's an olive green, large, long sleeve PSK t-shirt, cotton, and it has PSK on the sleeves and the logo on the back. So it is totally sweet. So today's question is, who is the one person that Danny Schayes would have at his dinner table if he could choose anyone, and what is his reason? Remember, send me an email with the answer, and in the subject heading, put giveaway, and in the body, state the answer and the reason why he chose that person. And the first person who gets the answer correct, I will mail this out within 48 hours to an address that you list in your email. And now back to this amazing interview right here in the Sports Deli. All right, KJ, Kevin Johnson, or Mr. Big Shot, Chauncey Billups?
I'm a big KJ fan. I not only as a player got to play with, and I love Chauncey too, Denver guy.
Yeah.
But KJ's my guy. He's was a big time in big situations. Great in the community, incredible human being.
Should be in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion.
Package. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I teach his move, and for the record, as a pro skills trainer, not one person in the NBA uses his KJ plyo push. And I've been teaching it for 30 years, and anyone that masters it literally goes by people and they cannot figure out how the move works. I've taught it to WNBA players, and it's an amazing freaking move. I would love to have him on. So if that is ever possible, I just want to give him props. For 30 years I've been teaching his move and calling it the KJ. Best nickname, Chocolate Thunder or the Greek Freak?
Ooh, I love Chocolate Thunder. Daryl had such an impact back in his day.
Totally.
And I got to play with him a little bit in Denver at the end of his career.
Yep.
Super funny guy. And
that's awesome.
So yeah, I'm going with Chocolate Thunder. Sticking with my old school boys.
Favorite food that makes you dance?
Ooh. As you know, I can really shake it. So that's a great question. Favorite food that makes me dance? I'm probably going to go with some good Thai food. Get that spice going.
Oh, wow! I was thinking maybe latkes, but we went with the Thai food. Okay, that's cool. Okay.
Going Thai food. Yeah. Well, when you grow up on bagels and cream cheese, there's not a lot of spice there.
That's right. Exactly. It's a little bit bland. Kobe or Larry?
Boy, again, a tough one. I'm. I thought, Bird was the complete everything player. I'm, fun to play with, fun to play against, Mr. Clutch, do it all. I'm going with Bird.
I love it. I heard him on Dan Patrick yesterday. He was freaking hilarious. Oh. Yeah. So inside the NBA, Chuck, Kenny, Shaq, or Ernie?
You know what? I always loved Ernie's kind of everyman shtick of being there and then dropping that little, that offbeat sense of humor thing. Ernie, I don't think gets nearly enough credit for just the vast intelligence he brings to that, to make that machine turn. I'm a big Ernie fan.
Biggest rival when you played at Syracuse?
Oh, Georgetown.
Yeah, for sure.
There wasn't a second. Georgetown, Syracuse made the Big East.
Yeah, for sure. LeBron or MJ?
MJ.
All in the Family or Sanford and Son?
Actually, you know what? I'm going to back up. I'm going to make that one a tie.
Oh,
I'm going to bail
interesting.
on that one because I think MJ changed the game in a way that pioneered so many things about the game beyond just being an incredible player. I looked at, when you talk about the unstoppable force against the immovable object, right?
Yeah.
MJ was the unstoppable force. I mean, he was, almost unbeatable in his way, with just will to win.
Yeah.
And LeBron is obviously just such a, amazing everything.
Yeah.
Great in the community. I mean, those are two guys that I don't know that you can pick one over the other at the end of the day. I mean, I went with MJ because of, again, my era. I got to play against him year after year and, saw that up close. But I'm a huge LeBron fan as far as what he, has brought. And one thing about LeBron, I get, it's remarkable to me how far people go to criticize the guy.
Amazing.
When he is head and shoulders above for so long, So I'm gonna make that one a tie.
And he's improved his game every year.
Every year.
And
what he does off the court for his longevity and in the community and Jordan did in the community. It was quieter than LeBron.
It was quieter, yeah.
But again, and Jordan had the benefit of not having social media in his era.
Absolutely.
So whatever warts were there, we didn't get to see. But it's I'm going with
a tie.
They're both on Mount Rushmore. Yeah,
absolutely. All in the Family or Sanford and Son?
You know what? That is another great one. I used to love Archie Bunker their famous Sammy Davis Jr. show.
Oh my God!
Where Sammy left his briefcase in the cab and came over. I thought Archie was. I mean, as fun as hysterical as Red Fox was. Archie was a game changer. I mean, he changed society.
Totally.
I think that show.
Oh,
we'll put that in the column of they couldn't make that show today.
Right. Absolutely.
You couldn't make that. I just saw a thing where the producer of Friends said they couldn't make Friends today.
Don said the same thing this week.
Couldn't make it today. Yeah, I mean, the guy was executive producer, so he couldn't make it today because you would need a more diverse cast, and you couldn't talk about any of the half the stuff they talked about.
Oh, unbelievable!
Jack or Tiger? I would say Tiger in his prime.
Willie or Hank? Willie Mays or Hank Aaron?
I think Willie was a more exciting to watch complete player.
Yeah.
So I'm going with Willie Mays.
Should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame? Wow.
Yes. With an asterisk, but
yeah.
I think there's, him not being in the Hall of Fame, a guy like some of those, those behavior issues. And again, I don't want to oversimplify that Pete was a behavior guy because obviously betting on baseball was a thing, but yeah. But I think that, it becomes too arbitrary when you start down that path. And even though Pete was an extreme example, when you talk, like some of the other guys who are, not being considered because of, then you go to the Barry Bonds, you go to Kurt Schilling, you go to, some of these other guys who statistically, without a doubt, but, were they, where does the moral, and then you look at, it's not like the Hall of Fame is full of moral guys, right? So if that's a thing, then it's a slippery slope.
Dick Vitale, Bill Walton, or Steve Lavin as an announcer?
I'm going to go Bill Walton. Dick Vitale is nails on the chalkboard for me. He seems to say the same thing over and over. Bill, I only know what he's talking about half the time, but I love Bill Walton. He's an awesome dude.
Brent Musburger or Vern Lundquist?
Brent.
Wow, interesting. Now, you played for 3 coaches that had arguably the best haircuts in the history of basketball. So who do you choose? Del Harris, Randy Fund, or Pat Riley's hair?
I think you got to go with Pat. He was famous for that. And but style, I'm picking Chuck Daly.
Chuck, that's right.
Chuck was the most stylish.
With his suits.
Well, he had a thing for watches, and he purposefully. Oh, he was famous for his wristwatches, and he purposefully had his suits tailored with his left sleeve shorter than the right one, so you could see the watch. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, 2 more questions real quick. Okay, if you had 5 people, past or present, to have at your dinner table, anyone, sports or not sports, who would be at your table?
Hmm. I got to put some thought on that one. That's a big one.
Belichick or Saban?
Saban. Belichick's too baggagey for me. I think I like what Nick brings to the table.
Yeah.
Belichick to me is too much the little dictator. Can't argue with success, right? You are what you are what your wins say you are.
For sure.
But between those two, I'll take Saban.
And where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I think that I have the ability to really, bring an influence to the world about, being where old school is cool. I think that
I love that.
there's a stability that is missing. There's a historical perspective that's missing. There's
in sports, or are you talking about globally?
Both.
Okay.
Both. And so I think that's where my focus is right now is really, because I was a fundamentals guy.
Right.
And to me, the fundamentals of the game and of life are not all that, negotiable or all that, variable over time. Certainly the, the styles and the pizzazz and the cultural parts, evolve.
But how do you go about being an influencer in the way that you're talking about?
Well, I'm getting more involved in, community issues.
Okay.
Starting within my own community, and looking to develop. I've done a lot of speaking and a lot of other things that I'm looking to get more more into. And I'm right now kind of refining what that message is going to look like.
Sure.
And we'll see how it goes.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, give us a tease for the next time you come on the show. Who's at least one of those people at the table?
I would say Abraham Lincoln.
Wow,
because
second person that chose him. Okay.
And the reason is because he lived at a time where the choices he had to make were excruciating in so many ways. And he stood up and made them and was responsible for them and, changed the world in a way that is tsunamic. Is that a word?
It is now.
And so, if I, for me, that's kind of a key. Somebody who lived at a time and had to, exist and make decisions in a way that are just, almost like beyond imagining. And how do you live in a world that's so far outside of reasonable, and, not only live, but excel in that environment?
Well, you're certainly following in his footsteps in a way. Your old school is cool, like you said, but you're also a forward thinker, and you're thoughtful when it comes to trying to understand and seek a greater understanding of not only yourself, but the world around you. And I wish you nothing but the best. Hopefully we can get you back on and talk shop a little bit more about Boeheim and some other things. Happy New Year, Shanatova. Talk to you soon, and tell your wife thanks for letting you go over a little bit, and much love and respect. We'll talk to you soon, Danny. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, that was a fascinating conversation with Danny Schayes, former Syracuse Orangeman and NBA player over an 18-year period, and just loved the conversation. So hope you enjoyed it. We'll definitely get him back on again to talk a little bit more about his college experience and some other things in the NBA. But I thought living in the current times that we are, to have someone so open and honest about the topics of race and sports and social injustice and systemic racism, and to be a white ally that he clearly is, and that he wants to get his message out to the masses globally, as you heard, as well as locally, is to be commended. So you can always send us an email to thesportsdeli@gmail.com. Check us out at thesportsdelipodcast.com. You can always DM me on Instagram at Mike Hootner and on Twitter at Michael Hootner. This episode of the Sports Deli Podcast, where everyone deserves a seat at the table, was brought to you by Hootie Hoot Productions. For Dr. J and Coach K, I'm Hootie Hoot. Please mask up. Black Lives Matter. Stop the Asian hate, and remember, it takes a village. And until next time, much love. Peace.